So you might be saying, well, then that means the government has to, take that money that it collects in that process and transfer it to those buyers, and it can't use that money for some other government purpose. You're exactly right in thinking that. Okay. So basically, what that has to mean is this pigovian tax revenue has to be put into a special account that would be separate from the general fund, tax account that most other taxes would probably go to. So as a result, if this policy were actually enacted, there would have to be language in the law enacting this policy that would have to say the revenue collected from the pigovian tax in this policy cannot go to the general tax fund account where it can be spent on other government purposes, but it has to go into a special account that will only be spent for the purpose of subsequently transferring that revenue to the buyers of the loans. Okay? So that's our first critical question problem, and that's how we answer that. Second critical question problem might be, well, how do we figure out an appropriate amount of pigovian tax and pigovian tax revenue that's not too small or too large? Well, I kind of talked about it earlier. You use computer programs mainly to figure out the appropriate RP plus LP, but you add those together, and that's what's not being charged in these subsequent sell-offs of the loans that should be charged, that the pigovian tax ends up trying to balance out. So in figuring and using computers again, and using computers and computer programs to figure out the appropriate RP plus LP, we will use that to figure out the appropriate amount of hopefully pigovian tax and pigovian tax revenue that is neither too large nor too small. Another question you might have is, well, in our example we had 100 individuals with equal risks, equal repayment risk. But in real life, we have different individuals, oftentimes with different risk. Well, you can look at it this way. Let's say our 100 borrowers had X amount of risk. Let's say we throw 50 more borrowers in the equation, so now we have 150 borrowers. And let's say those 50 more borrowers have a higher amount of risk. Let's say Y amount of risk. The graph might be differently, it might have different slopes, but the overall graph will still look the same. It'll just have different slopes and different numbers. Okay, so what will happen is this social cost curve, if it's more risky, it'll become more steep if we're looking at the market for just these 50 borrowers. Okay. And also, what will happen is the social curve, private cost to lender A plus tax, will also go up by even more because, again, the tax will be an even greater amount. Okay? And then let's say we add in 25 more borrowers. And they have an amount of risk that's less than the risk of the 50 and less than the risk of the 100. Let's call it a Z amount of risk. Well, again, we're not really changing the principles of the problem. We are just changing the numbers of the problem. So we're just changing RP and LP again. Those will be lower. We're just changing the pigovian tax and the pigovian tax revenue. And again, both of those will be lower. Social private cost curve will probably be less steep. And the social private cost to lender A plus tax will be lowered a little bit because, again, the tax will probably be low. So as you can see, as we throw in different individuals who have different risks, this does not change the principles of our problem, of our externality problem, and our proposed pigovian tax solution. All it changes is the numbers. Okay. So, for example, it just changes the RP, the LP, the pigovian tax amount, pigovian tax revenue. It'll change the slope of the supply curve, public cost. It'll change, how high or low the social private cost to lender A plus tax curve is, how high or low that supply curve is. It won't change the principles of that. It'll just change the specific numbers and measures, of that situation. Okay. and remember too, the pigovian tax will be different for each transaction based on the different risk, and therefore the different risk premium and liquidity premium for each borrower, for each loan sold in each loan sale transaction. Okay. Another question you might have is, okay, well, what about enforcement? Okay. The enforcement, how are we going to do it in a way that's not only effective, but cost effective? Okay. Well, we have a couple of solutions for that. First of all, we could use some general tax fund financing to pay for the enforcement costs, and also through using computers, through using a computer system, we can lower the cost of enforcement and also make the enforcement more effective. And also we can charge huge punishing failure to follow fees to any party that fails to pay. We can have substantial fees for that. Okay, and if the fee is large enough, then given the amount of the fee and the likelihood that they'll get caught, then hopefully most, if not all, sellers of the loans in those transactions will say, you know what, there's not really much incentive to cheat and to not pay the tax, so then we'll have incentive to pay the tax, therefore we pay the tax. We be honest. Let's be honest and pay the tax. Okay? This is how you do a case study. Again, you take you take a case study of a real life situation. In our example, the Great Recession of 2008. You take the economic concepts. In our example, we looked at the economic concepts of pigovian taxes, externalities, and the market interest rate model, and you apply that to our case study, which is what we did. And also then you look at the problems, you look at the solutions, and you also look at the positive and negative aspects of the case study. And based especially on the negative aspects of the case study, you ask questions, you attempt to find answers to those questions, see if any answers exist, and if so, are they good or bad answers? And if they're bad answers, can we ask even more questions, to generate even more answers? And are there perhaps some questions that might never be answered? Okay, at all. So in summary, we had our case study again in the Great Recession of 2008, and the time, especially in the time leading up to it, we had too many loans being issued at too low of rates of interest, especially to high-risk individuals, to high-credit risk individual borrowers. And so perhaps if the government had used the pigovian tax to prevent that externality problem from happening, perhaps the Great Recession of 2008, it could have, if not been prevented, perhaps it wouldn't have ended up turning out as badly as it did. So that's how you do a case study.